Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the organizer together this wonderful event. So thank all the local organizers for all the hard work that you have put in. While I was just trying to find the link to upload the presentation earlier this morning, and I was searching for the email sent by Ike. I found like 200 of them. So I realized how much hard work that he had put in putting everything together. So thank you very much. You may notice that I work in a chemical engineering department. You don't often see chemical engineering researchers in turbulence, let alone vortex. That is because we are not smart enough to come up with a mathematical definition for vortex. It was a more like side project that we worked on over the past few years. And the sound is like not continuous. Yeah. Okay, let me try that. Let me try if I have better luck with this one. So this is more of like a side project that we work on. Our main interest back then was we were studying the effect of polymer additives on turbulence. So we were studying the effect of viscoelasticity on turbulence. And as a result, we want to study the effects of polymer additives on vortex dynamics. And that's when we end up studying the vortex analysis. Our interest here is still focused on what we call axis lines of vortices, which is in line with the previous two presentations, in which they call them core lines. So we are interested in how do we extract axis lines from a turbulent flow field. We have a little bit of difference in the type of system we are interested in. We are interested in a well-developed turbulent flow in which you have really a lot of vortices. They come in all different shapes. They are all crowded together. And we try to extract every individual vortex line coming from that. So there's a lot of complexity in this task, and which is perfect problem for engineers to solve. So I don't think that this audience needs this slide. I'll start from this one. And I always started with the motivation by mentioning that we realized that we have been able to conduct direct numerical simulation for turbulence for nearly 40 years now, meaning that we have very direct access to all the 4 details of turbulent flow for nearly 40 years. But we still do not understand a lot about turbulence, despite we have all the information about turbulence in our computer simulation. And in most cases, we trust the simulation coming from direct simulation. The reason is being the simulation result is as complicated as the experiments are. Right? So those of us doing simulation are very used to these kind of these kind of visualizations. You run a simulation, you get a velocity field, then you use one of the vortex identification criteria to turn that into isosurface of vortex. Then you can see a lot of vortices from your simulation. You can see a lot of vortices from your simulation. If you have like a well-defined scenario, for example, if you look at a transition to the turbulence, or if you look at the dynamics, for example, of one single vortex ring, you can come up with a story about dynamics of a vortex by direct visual inspection about the image of or animation of your simulation. But we are studying a well-developed turbulence when you have a lot of what is going on, and they are all interacting with each other, talking with each other, in many cases colliding with each other. It becomes not handleable by a direct inspection. We need a computer to do that. The problem is that when computer look at this image, computer does not see vortices, computer see pixels. Right, computer doesn't understand what's going on here. So our overarching goal is we are trying to develop a set of computer tools that help us to automatically detect, extract those vortex objects from this turbulence simulation and quantitatively analyze that in an automated fashion. So that's the topic of our research here. My outline has three subject areas. The first topic is what we consider to be like a core platform of our toolbox called Weighted Vortex Axis Line Tracking by Iterative Propagation. That's a computer tool that can help us to extract the axis line from DNA simulation. Then I'll talk briefly about how do we apply the tool to help us enhance our physical understanding of visco light turbulence. Remember, that's our kind of home turf area. Then at the end, I'll briefly talk about some more recent work. We're doing collaboration with Professor Liu's group on integrating VTIP with Vortex, which is something we started basically a few months ago. So a lot of things are still quite preliminary. So I'll start with the basic tool here. Most of the work I'm going to discuss today are done by a former PhD student, Lu Zhu. So this tool was developed in 2019. So the idea here is that instead of focusing on the entire vortex tube, we focus on the axis line of the tube. Because axis line is a lot easier to handle and it captures most of the essential information. Not all the information, but most of the information you are interested in, including the position of the vortex, how big that is, what's the shape, and what's the topology. And most importantly, it also can tell you the individual identity of vortices, right? That's just comparison. If you use a volume-based method, right, you can come up with a volume-based method and can visualize a vortex using isosurface. Our eye can tell us, well, most of the time, our eye can tell us which one is one vortex, but computer cannot tell. Computer only see pixels. Obviously, you can still come up with some sort of computer classification algorithm in which you just look at every pixel, every cell in a numerical simulation, and you ask yourself the question, is this cell neighbor to another cell that's also part of vortex? Then you can group them together. So it's possible for you to come up with a grouping algorithm based on the volume, but still that will be dependent on threshold. That's the problem Professor Liu mentioned at the beginning, right? So if you change the threshold, the decision coming from the computer algorithm based on grouping, based on volume, will change. However, if we assume that every vortex has a unique axis line, then we go back. Every unique axis line mapped to one vortex. We can very clearly and unambiguously come up with the exact identity of each vortex. So that's the result coming from our axis line tracking algorithm. So if you track each axis line from turbulent flow field, we can tell every vortex apart and we color them with different colors. We can see very clearly different distinct vortices, and you can see that it's very consistent with our human eyes conclusion as well. So I'll just show you how we do that, right? So just to begin with, I made this statement before I learned about Vortex, by the way, because at that time we were mostly looking at different second-generation scalar-based vortex definition criteria, and I made this claim that even though that we are using Q criteria as the platform that we are working on, but there's really no attachment that we have towards the Q criteria. Any scalar method can do with our current algorithm with very little adaptation to do. And I'll talk about how to adapt this to Vortex later on. So the idea here is basically if you have a vortex, right? Our vortex is essentially a region of fluid in which the fluid is rotating around an axis, right? So there is an axis of a vortex, and our goal is to try to extract this axis. And if you cut the vortex along its transverse direction, along its cross-sectional plane direction, if you look at every cross-sectional plane, we make the assumption that the center axis of the axis point of that plane is where the Q is maximum, where you have strongest rotation. If you assume Q tells you how strong that rotation is, obviously that's not a very strict definition. Then as long as you find all those maximum points, if you are able to connect them, you can find your axis line, right? So you can find that the idea behind that was very much in line with what Professor Liu was introduction behind the Vortex. Except that, as I mentioned, we are not mathematicians, we are not smart enough to come up with a mathematically rigorous definition of vortex. And we are engineers, and for us, we are very good at, when we don't have a rigorous definition, we settle for next best thing. So we try to work with the existing criteria we have. So that's what we did back then. We are using Q criteria as the next best thing we had at that time. So in order to connect these points into a line, this, by the way, is also not a new idea. Hussein's group has been doing that like almost 30 years ago, right? There's a very intuitive method you can do. You can start with one point. You draw a cone, so detection cone, and you go forward when the next point falls into that cone, you connect them. You keep on going, you can connect it to line. The problem is that back then, back into the 90s, if you remember, there was a lot of interest in those pairwise streamer vortex, right? So the vortex of interest back then was mostly linear or quasi-linear. So this method works very well for quasi-linear vortex. And it starts to break down, obviously, when you start to get interested in hairpins and more complex three-dimensional vortices. And that's where we start to jump in. So we developed this method called a vortex axis tracking by iterative propagation. So the idea is start with the cone detection method from Hussein's group, that we can do a detection cone, we go forward, keep on connecting with the next point until you have no point to connect anymore. Then you decide you change direction. Then they keep on going in the other direction, no more point change to another direction. Then you keep on iterating between all three directions, and until the axis line you have extracted has converged. So if you think about that, it's very similar to Pac-Man, right? You release your robot, you release your Pac-Man into the maze, and you keep on trying to find the next being to eat, right? Collect each being into its vortex collection, right? Except that in our case, we are not only having one robot, we have like a lot of robots, right? So what we do here is that, I'm not going to go through the actual algorithm here. The actual algorithm here is actually very complex. But the idea here is that at a given plane, in the flow field, release a large number of robots, and you let the robots to chase the beams forward. But your algorithm have to keep on intervening to tell the robots, that's the end of road, you need to go to the next direction. And there are also other complexity you handle. For example, when the two robots meet, and then you have to tell the robots, the two of you are chewing on the same vortex, you need to combine into one vortex, etc. So that's essentially what we did. And this is just a test concept from a vortex transient strict growth simulation. Using the old method, obviously, it works very well in linear vortex, but when the vortex starts to break down, when the vortex becomes curved, right? You no longer, you fail to capture that the hairpin is one vortex, but we can capture the hairpin as a very continuous vortex. And when we submitted the paper, the reviewers did a very diligent work, raised a lot of criticism asking us to test about the robustness of the method. So we did a lot of tests to show how robust our method are. Indeed, so our initial submission was 29 pages. After revision, it became 47 pages. But we did a lot of additional tests to convince the reviewers that our method is really robust and insensitive to the parameters that we have selected. So what do we do with that information then? So there's a lot we can do, and we are just kind of skipping the surface at this moment now. One thing we can do is that because we have those axis line information of individual vortices, we can do statistics about the vortex of different shapes. So you can come up with a definition about what is a hairpin, what is a hook, let's say it's a half hairpin, what is a branch type, different type of branch vortices. Right, so a hairpin vortex will be one in which if you draw a line in the cross-sectional direction, it will have two axis points, right? Whereas hook is one in which if you draw a line, it only has 1 point, etc. So you can, based on the configuration of the axis line you are getting, you can come up with a different definition of vortex types, and you can do statistics about this definition. So you can group those vortex into different groups, right? By visual inspection, you can already see that although the plots are pretty crowded. So essentially what we did here, that we went to the simulation we have run. We just extract all the vortices we have in that simulation, then we group that into different types, right? You can see that grouping is very much consistent with our eyes intuition. And we can come up with statistics. We can look at the number of vortex, how the number of vortex of different types will change as a function of, let's say, increasing Reynolds number. And another thing we can do is that we can look at the lift-up statistics of vortex, right? So the vortex travel downstream, its downstream end will lift up. That's how you form the sideways branch of the hairpin. And we can look at lift-up statistics. Well, the way we do that is we look at the y position, one normal position of a vortex between the upstream end and downstream end, and we'll plot that into a kind of a joint PDF diagram. If the vortex is lying flat, then it will spread along the diagonal. if the vortex is lifting up, it will spread along the vertical line. And you can see that for streamline vortex, you have both lift up vortex and not a line, like a lying flat vortex. Whereas for the three-dimensional vortex, they're mostly lifting up. So that's also very much consistent with what we know. Another thing we did is that we can do cluster analysis. Right, so what we did is that we use a DP scan. That's a machine learning technique for classification, and to identify which vortices belong to the same group. And the nice thing about DP scan is that it doesn't have to be the vortex. It doesn't have to be identified based on geometric proximity, but you can actually group vortex based on how often they talk with each other, how often they interact with each other, right? For example, if you have two vortices that go like this, right? Even though they may look like they occupy the same geometric space, but they don't necessarily interact with each other that much. Compared with two vortices that go like this, even though they may be farther apart from each other, but these two legs are interacting more than the other configuration. So we can count how many points those vortices are interacting with each other, and use that criteria to decide which vortices belong to the same group, meaning that you interact more within the group than out of the group. And we can find that we can identify large groups of vortices which span the size about 500 to 1,500 wall unit, which happen to be the size of the so-called large-scale motions. We don't know whether that is a coincidence or whether that is a kind of a definitive proof that this is large-scale motions. We haven't really pushed this research deep enough to come up with a clean conclusion, but that definitely shows you the potential of this method. So the next is I'm going to show you how do we apply this, these results into the viscoelastic turbulence scenario that we have been studying. In particular, I will show you how, with the help of this tool, how it helps us to understand a very important experimental observation in viscoelastic turbulence. So the motivation of studying viscoelastic turbulence is because back to the time of the World War II, it has been found that you add a little bit of polymers into a turbulent flow, it's going to reduce the friction drag dramatically. And it is literally dramatically. It can be up to 80% reduction in the friction factor in certain scenarios. So that's a lot of energy saving in a turbulent flow field. And the reason here is because once you add polymers is a complex molecule which can interact with the flow motion. When you have a polymer that's in a turbulent flow, the shear force, extensional force is going to stretch the polymer chain apart into a more extended form. And the entropy force of the polymer will try to ask the polymer to coil back. The polymer is always, it's like elastic spring. The polymer always wants to coil back whenever the shear force is removed. So when it tries to coil back, it will add additional stress into the flow field. But the time scale for the polymer to coil back, there's a time scale, there's a lag here. So that's called a relaxation time. So once you stress the polymer to an extended form, it takes a while for it to coil back. And in a rapidly changing flow like turbulent flow, as you can imagine, the stretching and the relaxation is mismatched. And this mismatch can cause complex nonlinear coupling between the polymer dynamics and the turbulent flow field. So that's the essential physics that's going on here. And you can measure this lag in relaxation by the so-called Weissenberg number. That's relaxation time, essential relaxation time times the shear rate. Relaxation time times the time scale of the flow. So now that instead of looking at how the flow change as a function of Reynolds number, we are looking at how the flow change as a function of Reynolds number and the Weiss number. So we can have a bunch of different phenomena here. So we run direct numeric simulation. Essentially, we are basically coupling Navier-Stokes equation with additional viscoelastic constitutive equation. I'm not going to go into details. We can come up with DNS results you can capture with all the experimental phenomena. Essentially, with the increasing Weiss number, you can see the mean flow profile is increasing. That's drag reduction. You are getting higher hand mean flow as higher polymer effect you are seeing. And if you summarize the behavior we are seeing here, you can summarize this into this map. As you increase, so you can look at it in different ways, right? So if you At fixed Reynolds number, when you increase Weiss number, you can see a range of different behaviors starting from no drag addition, so-called low-level drag addition LDR, high-level drag addition HDR, and maximum drag addition. Our primary focus is between LDR and HDR transition here. The reason is because if you look at flow statistics between these two stages, in the buffer layer, you see very continuous change in the statistics across different stages of transition, drag addition. But in log-law layer, you have sharp transition between LDL and HDL behavior. So that indicates there's some qualitative change in the turbulent dynamics happening there. Nobody was looking into that problem. Everyone accepts that that's it is. When you have enough drag addition, that's what happens. But again, what I argue is that there's a change in vortex dynamics that's happening in that transition. So there's essentially the same transition in the log-law layer statistics that indicates there's a different mechanisms of drag addition, different mechanisms of vortex dynamics there. So that's what we are doing to analyze. So these are just direct DNS image, animations for LDR flow, which is very similar to what you will see in Newtonian flow, whereas the HDR flow, in which you can see that vortices are a lot more sparse, but they also become more clustered. So what we did is we applied VTIP to these simulations. You can again see that for different regimes here, Newtonian, LDR, HDR, you can extract all the vortex very reliably from our DNS results. Then we apply the same trick. We can analyze the different type of vortices at different regimes. What we see is that starting from a Newtonian limit to higher level drag addition, you can see a sharp transition between LDR and HDR. In LDR, the percentage of streamer vortex is almost constant, and it starts to increase in HDR, right? Notice that if you look at strength, intensity vortex is continuously changing as you increase the percent of drag addition. But here, if you look at the percentage, it's constant here. And if you combine all the three-dimensional vortices, they are almost constant at the beginning, at LDR, but they start to decrease, right? So there's a sharp transition in the streamline versus three-dimensional vortex between LDR and HDR transition. We also look at lift-up statistics. What we can see here is at LDR, you have a lot of lift-up streamer vortex. It almost disappeared at HDR. You can see this band, this concentration band, vertical band is disappearing. Most streamer vortices are lying along the diagonal. That means that the vortices are lying flat. They are not lifting up anymore. But for those helping and branch vortices, they always lift up, but you just have much fewer of them, right? So the conclusion we have here is that between the LDR to HDR transition, the streamer vortices are no longer lift up, or at least no longer lift up to the same frequency as it does in a Newtonian flow. So the polymer additive, polymer stress is interrupting the lift up process of vortices between the LDR and HDR transition. So I'll skip this one. We have like a more intuitive evidence. Now, at the end, I'll briefly talk about ongoing work that we are working with Professor Liu's group here about integrating VTIP with Vortex. It's mostly done by Prasam. Prasam, you can raise your hand. And as well as another excellent undergraduate student, Arisha Doga, in collaboration with Yifei, as well as the Professor Liu's team. So, you have seen the same set data, right, for in a few transitions today now, right? So this is what we have visualized the vortex using Q criteria. This is what we have visualized using the scalar magnitude of Vortex. And this is the visualization using the Vortex core line definition. And what we're really interested in is VTIP, right? So integrating Q criteria with VTIP, you can see that it's basically doing the same kind of good job that it was doing in the channel flow. You see very distinct vortices. We can also use the Vortex magnitude, but pretend the Vortex magnitude is the scalar definition, scalar criteria. And in that case, we can still do a reasonably good job. But our ultimate interest is directly work with the Vortex core points. So with the Vortex core points that if it give us, we are using VTIP to connect them into a line. That's what we're working on here now. So why we are interested in that? There are two directions. One is what can VTIP do to Vortex? What Vortex will enable is that because it's going to exactly extract all the vortices in the flow field, it allows you to do very quantitative comparison between different vortex identification, including different second-generation methods as well as Vortex. So when you have different vortex criteria, you can find the vortex vortex identified by, let's say, Q or lambda. And you can find the vortex identified by Vortex, and you can look at which vortices are common between the two sets, which are different between the two of them. And you can very exactly and quantitatively study the difference between the two. So we have a very clear picture about which vortices are consistently missed by, let's say, second generation criteria, but are catched by Vortex. In another direction, we are also interested in using Vortex in Vortex, right? There are two motivations for that. One is that Vortex can get rid of a threshold. Any second generation Vortex criteria we are using has a threshold. That becomes complex, especially when you are dealing with, let's say, high radial sample channel flow. We are primarily interested in channel flow. What we observe is if you have high radial number channel flow, there's a lot of room to develop in the one-number direction. The average vortex strength near the wall is very different than the average vortex strength near the bulk of turbulence. So if you use a one-size-fits-all solution, if you use one cutoff, one threshold, you either capture the near wall vortex, but you miss all those bulk region vortex, or the other way around, that you capture the bulk region vortex, but the near wall is a mess. But Vortex can essentially do a very good job in capturing the vortex of different strengths. Right, that's one reason. The other reason is that because Vortex is a vector-based criteria, it contains more information than what we had back in the scalar second generation criteria, meaning that the search we are having here can be more directed. We know the direction to search rather than just blinded search in every direction. And that can potentially improve the accuracy. And I don't have to go into that, but that can allow us to capture more arbitrarily shaped vortices. So that's the end here. Basically, in summary, what I want to argue is that despite that we are capable of doing highly reliable simulation of turbulence, we have all the details of turbulent flow field. Our understanding of turbulence is still rather limited because the complexity of a vortex dynamics, because the number and the sheer number and the type of interaction they have between them is beyond what we can handle. We need computers to analyze that. And our goal is trying to develop a set of computer tools that can allow us to automatically analyze those vortex objects and their dynamics in a statistically reliable way without human intervention, without any subjective criteria, and with high efficiency. So with that, let me thank all the funding agencies that supported research. The idea initially came from Lu Zhu attending a workshop held by Javier Jimenez in Madrid, I think 2017. That's a little dated group, a picture of my group. If you want to visit, press them all the way at the end of the table. And with that, I'll end here. I'll be happy to answer any question you may have.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Xi.